Hi there, this is Reverend Daniel Gregoire, the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Grafton and Upton in Massachusetts. And here's a recording of the sermon that I delivered to the church on Sunday, February 19th. The title of the sermon is The Harlem Church, and I'll start off with the reading that accompanies it. And I apologize for the sunlight. I'm not normally this radiant, but this is the time of day where the sun pours into my office. So if it adds for extra drama, I hope you'll allow for it. The sermon had this reading with it. Man in the Arena by Theodore Roosevelt. Man in the Arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. Credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly and errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who actually strives to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be among those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Here ends our reading. And I should just say that this reading obviously uses dated language, and that being the use of man to represent both men and women. We know that this reading is meant to describe all people who strive and who dare greatly. So the saints of our tradition are not shrouded in mystery or magic or miracle. They're people like you and me who have dedicated their lives and efforts to building a more just and more noble world. And they call out to us, saying, not just follow me, but surpass me. Go onwards and upwards forever. Dare to be great. In the spiritual practice of daring to be great, we reveal the holy part inside of all of us. So greatness is something that comes from within and outside of us, and it links us to something greater than ourselves. But it's important to know that greatness doesn't necessarily go with success in a venture, but it's always associated with the effort itself. Greatness is found in the doing or the attempt to do. Greatness is found in living with a purpose and working with that purpose in mind. Our saints have entrusted us with the future, not just the future of this religious movement, but with the destiny of the human enterprise, which is, at its heart, to grow closer to each other and closer to God. Our saints require us to do as well as to be. As our guest preacher from last Sunday, Win Craft, reminded us, our saints remind us to live as if extraordinary things are possible. Today we're going to explore the life and times of one UU saint, the Reverend Ethelred Brown, the one-time minister of the Harlem Unitarian Church. Harlem is at the northern end of Manhattan in New York City, and it has been the epicenter of Black American culture and intellect from the time of the Harlem Renaissance in 1920 until today. The Harlem Renaissance saw the emergence of a distinctly Black literary style, seen in poetry and novels, new forms of music and art, as well as a burgeoning political movement that saw Black empowerment and specifically Black pride as necessary tools for achieving freedom and equality in what was then an actively racially segregated and repressive society. The Harlem Church was started in that context in 1920 and it closed its doors forever in 1956. Pastor Brown was an immigrant from the island of Jamaica, and he served as a minister of the Harlem Church during its, I guess we have to say, short and tumultuous life. Pastor Brown was ahead of his times in many ways, and in some ways perhaps too far ahead. But he shows up on our timeline when he did, if anything, to give us a taste of the bigger and better things to come in later years. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there was a Harlem Unitarian Church or a Reverend Ethelred Brown. It's an easy thing to do. I was surprised when I learned about them, and I wondered why hadn't anyone said anything until now about it. But isn't it always the case that history is delivered in these tiny, bland, arid pellets, dry and without flavor, when actual history is far more interesting and complex, juicier than anything that we could learn in a history class, which tended to focus on a slew of mostly white men doing things, with a smattering of women and a sprinkling of racial minorities, and a pinch of differently abled and queer people, only added before the end of our, soup. Our civilizational soup was done. We are a melting pot, right? But everyone who is here now was also here in the past. History is populated with all sorts of people doing ordinary and extraordinary things. And they were doing them all the time, everywhere. History is, as the author William Faulkner wrote, neither dead nor really past. It's our story. We were there then, and we are here now. So let's take a moment to look at the photo on the order of service. The order of service had a picture of Reverend Ethelred Brown. And this picture of him is as he appeared when he was a young man. He is with us now as well. He is sharing our journey as a people of faith. He is our companion on this journey as Unitarian Universalists, as seekers of the good, as makers of justice. And he is saying to us, is whispering in our ear if we listen, don't just follow me, surpass me. And he deserves credit for all of the things he did, even though the church that he founded did not live up to his expectations. Pastor Brown deserves to be lifted up as an example of a resilient person, resilience being our theme for the month. And we can follow his example in our own way, not so much by being like Pastor Brown, but by doing like him. Each of us has a part to play in building something wonderful, something that no one believes to be possible, and that thing might even outlast us. Or it might last as long as it's needed and cease to exist when its useful life is spent. There is a time and a season for every purpose under heaven. And in our reading, Man in the Arena by Theodore Roosevelt, we see three qualities of a person who dares greatly. In other words, who lives the life of dignity and worth that is our common birthright. We become great by demonstrating enthusiastic devotion in our living. We become great by working in some worthy cause beyond ourselves. And lastly, we become great by knowing and accepting triumph and defeat and continuing all the same. We become great by demonstrating enthusiastic devotion in our living. We become great by working in some worthy cause beyond ourselves. And lastly, we become great by knowing and accepting triumph and defeat. And to these three, I would add the overarching quality of presence, just being, just showing up. And if we can't be enthusiastic in our living, and if we can't be connected to some worthy cause beyond ourselves, and finally, if we find that we cannot accept triumph, or the harder to accept defeat, at a minimum, we can be present in the struggle that is living, not absenting ourselves from lived reality through drink or drug or possessions or overwork, or fantasy, or some other cheap escape. Pastor Brown shows us those three qualities and the overarching quality of presence. And as such, he deserves all of the credit due a person who goes out into the world, strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because that's what it means to do something. We are not always going to win, and certainly not win in the ways that we hope for, but we must continue to show up. Credit belongs to the one who shows up. It's easy to be a critic, Roosevelt wrote. To find fault, to point out where others stumble, is not an accomplishment. The voice of the critic does not count in the end. Credit belongs to the person who shows up. And so Pastor Brown, before he was Pastor Brown, shows up in Jamaica. At that point, still part of the British Empire. Our story begins in 1907. Ethelred Brown was 32 years old and recently dismissed from the Jamaican civil service. It was a devastating blow to himself and his young family, at the time consisting of a wife and 4 children. But in this crisis, he saw a way open, and a chance to respond to what he understood to be his call to ministry. In the book Black Pioneers in a White Denomination by Mark Morrison Reed, the author excerpts a reflection from Pastor Brown where he wrote, this is him describing kind of the dialogue going on in his head. You knew beyond doubt that you, him speaking of himself, were called to ministry, but you resisted the call because your position in the civil service was financially secure. Now God himself, in his own way, has deprived you of the security. Your duty is clear, he ends. Somewhat earlier, Brown struggled with his Anglican faith and had serious doubts about the theology, especially the doctrine of the Trinity. Brown then discovers that he has an uncle who's a Unitarian, and his uncle at his house had books and tracts from the United States, from the American Unitarian Association, and these were lying all over his house. And Brown read these materials, and according to the author, Mark Morrison Reed, he follows up by finding more books, expanding his knowledge about Unitarianism, and finally, he wrote a slew of letters, sending them to New York to any minister who would respond and help him to learn more about Unitarianism and where he might go to study to become a minister. Now, this brought him to the attention of Franklin Southworth, then the president of Meadville Theological School in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Southworth invited Brown to study at Meadville, but explained to him that his prospects would be limited. It's important to note that Southworth is reported to have said that there was no Unitarian church in America for colored people, and that white Unitarians would require a white minister. This was the 1930s. Morrison writes that given the obstacles Brown faced in becoming a Unitarian minister, it's a wonder he became one at all. I would say so too. Fast forward a few years, Brown completes his study at Meadville and is ordained at the school, Reverend. He goes back to Jamaica with the intention of starting a Unitarian church there, a missionary church in Montego Bay. The project ends in disappointment. Jamaica is not ready at that time for such a radical departure from Christian orthodoxy as Unitarianism was. So Brown decides to leave Jamaica for New York City, settling in Harlem, the epicenter of Black culture in the United States. And that is where he would start his Unitarian church. He was 45 years old. At that time, as quoted in Morrison, he wrote, I believe in and still believe in Unitarianism as a religion of the future, the religion with an emancipating message which all people of every race may understand and accept. And the church where he would share that Unitarian message would come to be known as the Harlem Unitarian Church, and for as long as it existed, worshipped in rented halls in the Harlem YMCA. Over the 3 decades of its existence, the Harlem Unitarian Church, under the leadership of Pastor Brown, was consistently reinventing itself, finding new ways to reach the population of Harlem and beyond, but with very little success. Its focus varied from religious expression to a more political bent, and it attracted a host of people mostly on the margins of Harlem society of that time, Marxist and socialist elements of the Harlem political class. The church never attained a critical mass of members to sustain itself and relied very heavily on support from the American Unitarian Association and from other Unitarian churches in Manhattan, most notably the Community Church of New York, where I was at one time a student minister. Finally, the church closed its doors for good in 1957, although it had essentially been defunct long before then. It closed right around the time that Pastor Brown died. There are many factors related to the church's failure to launch. Those factors include racism at work in society at large and the racism at work within the denominational body, the AUA. The church also faced difficulty due to colorism and ethnic prejudice within the Black community, both in Jamaica and in Harlem. Financial mismanagement on the part of Pastor Brown also played a role in the demise of the church. But while the church was not a success, I believe that it had fulfilled its mission for the time and place that it occupied. Pastor Brown himself was put in the difficult position of what Mark Morrison Reed calls being a Black pioneer in a white denomination. And being a pioneer offered opportunities and risks. It should be noted that Pastor Brown actually had the option of training to become an African Methodist Episcopal minister, a majority Black denomination, at around the time that he was also considering study at Meadville Lombard. And that might have been an easier choice. But he chose to risk it all and to live out the truth of his convictions, and especially the conviction in the radical oneness of God. And he paid a very heavy price for it. In his living, Pastor Brown showed enthusiastic devotion to his calling as minister, and his desire to spread the message of Unitarianism to communities in Jamaica and New York were definitely a cause beyond himself. And he worked in the worthy cause of spreading not just this religion, but the ideals of political freedom, both in Jamaica and in New York, at a time when it was desperately needed. He accepted with remarkable grace his triumphs and his even more remarkable failure. And most of all, he was present. He showed up again and again. If we are to become great, this is the pattern rather that we must follow. We become great by demonstrating enthusiastic devotion in our living. How will we demonstrate that devotion? We become great by working in some worthy cause beyond ourselves. So the question that I have for you, what venture beyond yourself will you work on? Who will you gather around you to help in that worthy effort? We become great by knowing and accepting triumph and defeat and continuing all the same. Accepting triumph is easy, but will we accept defeat when it comes? And rather than becoming stuck in a failure, will we continue all the same? Our world sorely needs people who show the vision and the courage to show up again and again in the same way that Pastor Brown did. The very short existence of the Harlem Church shows us our potential. It shows us our blind spots. It shows us where we need to go in the future. We must become the people who, as our reading discloses, actually strive to do what must be done. Today, let us be who we are meant to be, the people who show great enthusiasm, great devotion, and who spending his or her their energies on worthy causes. We are a people who know triumph, and we know defeat. But my hope is that whatever it is that must be done, we will choose to do it. We are called to follow in the footsteps of the saints who have come before us, the saints who are saying, don't just follow me, but surpass me. May it be so, and amen.